Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. Water seeks a level surface, which is why scenes like this are possible. The elevation of this lake is nearly identical at all points. The same principle applies with the oceans, which are all interconnected. If there was significant sea level rise in one ocean, it would have to appear in all the other oceans as well. Yet tide gauges show very large differences in apparent sea level rise rates. The one at Stockholm, Sweden shows a sharp decline in sea level over the last 130 years. The reason why some tide gauges show sea level rising and others show sea level falling is because of movement of the land underneath the tide gauge. At Stockholm, the land is rising, so it appears like sea level is falling. But the thing to note about this graph is that the rate of decline has been constant over the last 130 years. At Stockholm, the beaches are expanding at the same rate now as they were in the late 19th century. The science is pretty simple, but now let's look at a claim from Reuters. They say global sea levels are rising about 4 millimeters per year, double the rate of the 20th century, and may soon overtake the 5 millimeter annual rise in land elevation in the Stockholm region. The Reuters article shows upwards curvature in sea level, indicating that the rate of sea level rise is accelerating. But the actual tide gauge data from Stockholm doesn't support their claim. There's no upwards curvature, and sea level is falling at the same rate now as it was a long time ago. There isn't one shred of evidence to support their claim that sea level is going to start rising soon in the Stockholm region. Now let's look at their claim from NASA that sea level is rising about 4 millimeters per year, double the rate of the 20th century. This graph from NASA showed that sea level rise rates slowed dramatically after 1950 until 1994, and then suddenly in 1994, sea level rise rates doubled. This slowing in sea level rise rates after 1950 is curious because in the 2018 version of the same graph, it didn't exist. In the 2018 version of the same graph, they showed a fairly steady rate of sea level rise from 1870 until the late 1990s. So NASA rewrote history between 2018 and the present to make it look like there was a sharp increase in sea level rise rates after 1994. It's an interesting theory from NASA, but it's not supported by any evidence. There's no upwards curvature at Stockholm. At Easter Island, there's been no change in sea level over the past 50 years, and certainly no upwards curvature. At Sydney, Australia, there's been a slight increase in sea level, but no increase in the rate of sea level rise. There's no upwards curvature in this graph. It's the same story in Hawaii. Over the past 70 or 80 years, there's been no change in the rate of sea level rise. There is no upwards curvature. In Italy, sea level has been rising at the same rate for the past 150 years. There's no upwards curvature. There's no indication of an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. Same story in the San Francisco Bay. The rate of sea level rise has been constant for the past 80 or 90 years. Like other tide gauges in Hawaii, the tide gauge in Honolulu also shows no upwards curvature. The rate of sea level rise is the same as it was 120 years ago. In Finland, the land is rising and sea level appears to be falling. But once again, it's the same rate as it was 100 years ago. There's no upwards curvature. Few, if any, of the long-term tide gauges in the world show any indication of an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. They're all linear trends. There's not the slightest evidence that humans have had any impact on the rate of sea level rise. NASA says that sea level is rising more than 4 millimeters per year, but NOAA says something very different. They say it's less than half that. This claim from Reuters is completely fake. There's no scientific evidence to support the claims they're making. The whole article hinges on some fraudulent claims from NASA about an acceleration of the rate of sea level rise during the 20th century, which didn't actually occur. More than 90% of NOAA tide gauges show a sea level rise rate which is lower than what NASA claims is the average. The NASA claim is absurd. It doesn't have any scientific basis. Sometime during the last 6 years, NASA altered their data to make it appear like there was an acceleration in the rate of sea level rise. But this was propaganda. It was not based on evidence. The tide gauge at Lower Manhattan shows about the same rate of sea level rise as what was occurring when Abraham Lincoln was president. That rate is a little less than 3 millimeters per year. Remember that number because I'm going to refer to it again in a few seconds. NOAA created a set of predictions for acceleration in sea level rise rates in Lower Manhattan, and they failed rather badly. Observed sea level rise at Lower Manhattan has been below the extreme scenario, the high scenario, intermediate high, intermediate low, and low scenario. There's not the slightest bit of legitimate evidence that humans have had any influence on the rate of sea level rise. But now comes the punchline. Last month, the New York Times ran this article, "The East Coast is Sinking." The point of this article was to scare people. They wanted people to believe that not only is sea level rising, but the land is sinking and they're all going to drown. They said Boston is sinking up to 3.8 centimeters per decade. New York is sinking more than 3 centimeters per decade, and Atlantic City, New Jersey is sinking up to 4 centimeters per decade. They say that New York is sinking more than 3 centimeters per decade, which is greater than the apparent rate of sea level rise from the tide gauge. So if we believe what the New York Times is saying, we also have to believe that there's no sea level rise at Manhattan. All of the apparent sea level rise is due to the land sinking. The press has been trying to scare people about New York and London going underwater because people are using fossil fuels. And here's the same story from 90 years ago, April 1934. Well, melting icebergs engulf the world, and they show Manhattan underwater. Nothing the press says about climate ever seems to have any basis in fact or anything to do with reality. And they use every imaginable type of fake data in order to achieve their goals. Since leaving the White House, Barack Obama has purchased $30 million worth of mansions on the beach in Massachusetts and Hawaii. This gives me 2 valuable pieces of information. First is that Obama doesn't actually believe the propaganda he was spreading about sea level rise, and the second is that the climate scam pays extremely well. Toto has been pulling back the curtain on the climate scam for 16 years. You can visit him and his family on the web at realclimatescience.com.